The emergence of the teddy boy in post-war Britain saw teenage culture arrive with a real bang. Yet most people think it's a working class movement, except its roots are based firmly in Savile Row. Surprising, perhaps. Well, this book tells you all about it. It's Teddy Boys, and alongside me, Max Decharne is the man who tells the story. Max, thanks so much for joining us and to talk about this, because where we sit here in the Mason's Arms with the 39 clubs presence around us, just down the road, the greatest working class look ever started with some toffs, sort of thing.
The working class, it's a completely working class movement, Teddy Boys. It's not, compared to, say, punk, where you had people from quite a few different social backgrounds all being important parts of that scene. Teds were just working class from start to finish. But what they did, they half-inched a look which Savile Row had been trying to persuade quite successfully in the late 40s and the beginning of the 50s. Well-heeled, what they said, guardsmen, clubmen, literally minor members of the royal family, Prince Philip, all these people. In the days when Savile Row and the papers would very much say, here's what you're going to be wearing, here's what the fashion police have decided you're going to be wearing next week. And that held true for women. And straight after the war, 45, 46, the Edwardian revival was the biggest thing in women's fashion. Christian Dior's new look is completely Edwardian. I mean, I did have a phrase in my book, I cut it out, but it was the idea that it's a new look inside Granny's wardrobe is basically what it was. And that was a heavy thing for, if you wanted to be fashionable, because cloth was strictly rationed.
So you're looking at a piece of clothing with the most cloth that you could possibly squeeze into it.
And so the French, it came out of the Paris catwalks, Dior, Balmain, they could afford it, and they could also source the cloth. Over here, there was lots of arguments in the upmarket women's magazines just saying, that's all very well, but you know, you can't get that. You know, even with all of your coupons for the year, you can't have a train of 26 feet of expensive material behind it. But it was a very successful revival. Everything was Edwardian in women's fashions, haircuts, the whole lot. So by 1949, Savile Row started thinking, why don't we do this for men? And that coincided with the nostalgia. Essentially, the Second World War had trashed this country. We were bankrupt. You got bomb sites everywhere. People were looking back to the last time. Imagine you're 50 or 60. The last time when things were good, that last summer before the First World War, the time of their youth for a lot of these people. So you have things like Ealing comedies, like which is 1949, Kind Hearts and Coronets. It's totally Edwardian. And Dennis Price is wearing some really sharp Edwardian suits for that. So it was in the air, basically.
And yet, and we know there's a guy, Bunny Roger, legendary for walking up and down Savile Row, effectively as some kind of strange prototype teddy boy, but that would have been a stretch at the time.
But with a bowler hat.
With a bowler hat. That still seems an enormous quantum leap.
It is.
From where we get. Is there an obvious way obvious route of how that happened?
Well, it was very visible. It's all over Pathé News, it's all over not just the upmarket papers who loved it, but also the tabloids, the Daily Mirror, Daily Mail. So imagine you're a working class kid in the places where it really started to take off, which was the Elephant and Castle, the poorer bits of Notting Hill, the East End. You're going to be seeing this in the papers that your parents are reading. But it was what are the posh what they're up to. But suddenly, because if you've had a war that's killed a huge chunk of the adult male population, the working age population, we had full employment in the 50s. So you left school at 15, nothing was expected of you, but you could get a job, a well-paid job, because the employers, for once, actually had to pay a decent wage. If you didn't like that employer, if you didn't like that job, you could walk out of it and the same afternoon get another job. So these 15-year-old working class kids, they could go to their local tailor in the East End or in the Elephant and Castle and say, look, I've seen this picture in the paper. Can you knock me off what Bunny Roger is wearing, or anybody? Hardy Amies, the Queen's dressmaker, was wearing Edwardian. So was Cecil Beaton, the society photographer. So you've seen it, and you can go and get a cheaper version of it.
But clearly jazz it up.
Jazz it up, yes.
Because obviously, again, that gap between the Edwardian look to Teddy Boy,
Yes.
You wouldn't mix the two up, would you?
No, you wouldn't, because chiefly look at a picture of Edward VII, who obviously he's the Edwardian. What shape is he? You know, he's this, and there's actually an article in the Times talking about the posh revival of it, saying we just don't have the waistlines to carry off the Edwardian look, because you're supposed to be, you know, wearing a belt that could go around an elephant, because you've had so many expensive lunches.
Yes.
And then you've got during a time of rationing, which was still going on in many aspects of life until late 54, early 55. You've got these people who are really dramatically thin, so it looked better on them as clothes horses. And if you're supposed to have a fingertip drape, you know, they would have it longer than these people would have, and
trousers shorter.
Yes, and also because everyone's going to their own individual tailor. There's a bunch who were down in Portsmouth, where I'm from, and they were photographing themselves all the time, or going to their local photography place just for a laugh. They had spare money in their pockets because they had well-paid manual jobs.
Right.
So they could go dancing, they could go to the cinema, they could get bespoke clothes, and they were so proud of it, they'd have their photograph taken. And you'll see a group of them, it's almost like a school class photograph, but sometimes they've got black eyes, literally, or they've come along with a football or with a cuddly toy. They're grinning like mad. They're just obviously proud of how they look, and they all look different.
Yeah.
It's not a standardised uniform.
Very interesting. And again,
different styles, different socks, different shoes.
that establishes perfectly well
yourself.
why it became the teenager was invented in this country in that moment. It obviously had to. It changed from there because, of course, it's got to spread around. It's got to become a bit of a phenomenon. Could you bite off the peg in some places eventually?
Initially, not everybody was getting either a local tailor to do it or just getting their mum to do it. Tom Jones, I don't know if you ever read Tom Jones's autobiography. It's called Over the Top and Back Again. Came out about 5 years ago. He was a teenage teddy boy in South Wales, working class guy. He was doing one of these ratty little jobs. He worked in a glove factory, which was I think it was just a Nissan hut. And there were older guys there who were into Mantovani and stuff like that. And he was like, oh no, rock and roll, mate, that's what you want. And he'd seen what a teddy boy looked like, and he wanted to be that. He stole a little piece of velvet from the glove factory, just an offcut, took it home. He got hold of an old jacket of his dad's that was way too big for him. And he said, basically he got his mum to sew a velvet collar on it. He said, before she did that, it's just an oversized jacket of my dad's, and I look stupid in it. As soon as I've got this velvet collar, he said, walking down the street, I don't know whether swearing is permitted in...
Let's give it a go.
He said, what he says in his book, he says, with this velvet collar, he says, I'm a jiving, thriving, 6 foot tall teddy boy, and you'd better fucking watch it. It's the attitude, and he got that just from a piece of velvet on his collar.
It is attitude.
And I remember the punk days in 76, where you didn't know what to wear. You wanted to go along to the bands, and going to the gigs was half the joy of it. Was looking around to see what these other teenagers. What are you wearing?
Yeah,
because the guys on the front cover of the book.
Yes,
they're in the Tottenham Royal Ballroom, photographed by Picture Post magazine, who were the best really at recording everyday life. And a lot of their photographers were ex-war photographers, so they were there. They were used to observing and not really judging. They were just, I'm going to show you what it's like. These guys are all 15, and if you look at those 4 suits, they're not identical. There's different. No. Somebody might have said, actually, I want 5 different pockets, little pockets.
Yeah.
So there's no uniform.
So there is no cartoon character. Well, there is.
And yet they were being people like Roy Elliott in the Mirror were cartoon, and Giles, the famous cartoonist. They were caricaturing them as early as 1954. That's pre-rock and roll hitting the
That would make
charts.
sense. I need to let me ask you a very nerd question first, because the shoes.
Yeah.
Because our age group, our generation, will always put a brothel creeper on a teddy boy, but that wouldn't make any sense because I imagine that was a very difficult shoe.
It wasn't.
It wasn't probably been invented.
No, they were around from the 40s. Thick crepe-soled suede shoes.
Wow.
Tell you who was wearing them in 1951? Duke of Edinburgh was wearing them.
Naturally.
Handmade, £10 they were costing, and that's £10, 240 pence to the pound. The Daily Mirror was 1 penny.
Okay.
So £10 is a lot of money.
Yeah.
In fact, your average wage, weekly wage, was about 11 quid for a...
Okay, so there were other shoes, didn't they? But there was that suede creeper was already part of the story.
It was around, and some people were other Teds were just wearing standard sort of black brogues, basically. But no, I thought that they were a bit of a later thing. When I was a teenager, I thought they must have come afterwards. But no, they were around.
I'm going to touch on sort of our generation version of that in a minute, but what we definitely need to deal with is the reputation that Teddy Boy's got, which is fundamentally, it would seem, based on just the loose language of using the name.
If you were smashing up your local dance hall in 1949, or vandalising a bus stop, or mugging an old lady, you would be called in the press a yob, a hooligan.
Yeah.
Both names, well, hooligan was late 19th century name. By 1952, you'd be called a cosh boy, because that was the great scare of the early 50s, because there was a series in the Daily Herald called Cosh Boy, and there were a lot of cosh robberies going on at the time, but there were also a lot of gun robberies. London was full of weapons that people had brought back from the war. You know, there were lots of stabbings, but the press, there was this. It was a moral panic. It was a folk thing that suddenly everybody was a cosh boy. And somebody wrote a play. It was a big hit on the West End. Wasn't very good. And a cheap film company bought the rights immediately in 52, made the film in 53. And it's essentially, if they'd have made that film a year later, that film would have been called Teddy Boy.
Right.
And it ran into all the problems that 2 years later the film Rock Around the Clock had, which is to say councils were banning it in Scotland or in just anywhere, Plymouth, because people were worried, if my son goes to see this film, he will immediately go and rob a post office, cosh the person behind the counter. And there were just thousands of articles, literally thousands of articles in the press in 52 and 53, by which time the Teds had come along. And if you do a search on newspaper archives, it just drops off a cliff, and then all the references are for Teds, and it's the same thing. So essentially, the Teds inherited a violent reputation in 53 when they acquired the name, and they added to that because the first Ted banner headlines were it wasn't mugging, causing trouble at a dance or smashing something. It was a fatal murder on Clapham Common. Now, the Pistols in 76, it was just a bit of swearing on the Bill Grundy show.
Yes.
So that's relatively mild compared to one group of teenagers stabbing another teenager on Clapham Common at an open-air dance, and they were all wearing Edwardian gear.
Right.
And one of their girlfriends, it became an Old Bailey very high-profile trial. It ran through the whole summer of 53. And at one point, one of their girlfriends in the dock said, we wouldn't dream of going out with anybody who's not wearing Edwardian clothing. And they're all sort of 15, 16-year-olds. And she then said, the Edwardians, or as we call them, the Teddy Boys. And that was reported on the front cover of the Daily Express in September, I think it's September the 3rd, 53. And by a week later, there's a judge up in north of England somewhere, saying sentencing a few kids for something mild, said if you're not careful, you're en route to being a Teddy Boy. By Christmas, that word was everywhere.
Wow, that's
it's
amazing.
How quickly it went.
I love that. It's worth. You've touched on it a couple of times, and this because it's where I come in because of my age. We're same as you. Ted hasn't gone away. I know that in the mid-70s, it was all over the place.
It was.
Shawaddy Waddy, as a leading example.
Or Mud wearing drop jackets.
Mud did the same thing.
But my favourite, Wizard, Roy Wood
was always
on top of the pops, wearing drape jackets, wearing creepers.
And then but of course, I guess where it's just to kind of underline that teenage angst part of it. Malcolm McLaren.
Yeah.
His story is crucial in the continuation of it all, isn't he?
He started out down the... I wrote one of my books was a history of the King's Road.
Yes.
And he and Vivian, they started out literally squatting at the back of a shop called Paradise Garage, 430 King's Road, which had already been 3 or 4 different iconic boutiques, Hung on You, Mr. Freedom, etc. And Malcolm's first thing was that Teds were so out, let's bring them back in.
Right.
There was a 50s revival. There had been, you had the 1972 Wembley Rock and Roll show about a year after Malcolm started out. You had a lot of things. You had the rock and roll revival shows going on in the States, plus many of the originals had always had a solid market over here. If you wanted to see Little Richard, Gene Vincent, those Jerry Lee, this was a better country to see them in than the States, all the way through the 60s. So that audience had never gone away. And Malcolm he has a shop called Let It Rock and starts selling Teddy Boy drapes, creepers, and also memorabilia. And the guy helping him out with sourcing the vintage rock and roll 45s and a lot of the memorabilia is the great Ted Carroll, who then founded Chiswick Records and Ace Records and reissued so many of the great 50s rock and roll and blues and R&B records. And he had come over to this country, he's from Dublin. I interviewed him for the book. He came over because he was road managing Thin Lizzy when they at the beginning of their burst into fame. So Malcolm is pushing that for a couple of years and then decides that actually leather and PVC is the way to go and changes the shop's name to Sex. But before he did that, this 15-year-old came in and started working as a Saturday boy, and he'd gone to that shop because he'd heard it was one of the only places you could get creepers, and that's Glenn Matlock 2 years before he joined the Sex Pistols. Wow. So there were these little outposts. It was generally around in the 70s, but when you hear about Teds and punks fighting on the King's Road, look at all the pictures, look at the picture agencies. These supposed Teds are the same age as the punks.
Yes.
This is
so
not,
the middle-aged
this is not original.
Turned
50.
up. No, right.
No, they would have been late 30s original Teds.
Yeah.
With families and better things to do than going down the King's Road on a Saturday afternoon and battering a load of 16-year-olds.
What's the inheritance? What's the heritage that we've got? Is it still apparent? I mean, we still see the clothes.
Yeah, you do.
Pop up in not necessarily as a whole look, but the influence is still around, isn't it?
Well, the odd thing is it didn't really spread to Europe until later, much later. But now you've got French teddy boy bands, you've got Scandinavian teddy boy festivals, literally, and there's a lot of people got into the music and then got into the look on the back of the music, and their big heroes tend to be Crazy Cavan and the Rhythm Rockers, who were regarded as the great teddy boy band because they had a single called Teddy Boy Rock and Roll in about 73, 74, I think it was their first single. The sort of people who kept the flame going. So the influence has never really gone away, and you can still find Teds if you go to the right places, but everything's fragmented these days. It's like in the mod scene. If you don't need the mainstream media to tell you where there's a good mod dance or occasion, or if you're into vintage 50s American cars, again you're connected via social media or whatever. So Teds know where to find each other, but I think their big importance is they were the first. They were the first in this country, post-war, of young people who were just supposed to shut up and become a small version of their parents, basically. Start dressing like your dad, go out to work, get married. My parents were supposed to be married before the age... I mean, my dad was older than 20, but my mum was 18, back in the 50s. And one of 4 sisters, all 4 of them were married before the age of 20. Yeah. So the path from teenager to adult, settle down, get a job, stop dressing strangely. And you do see original interviews with Teds in the 50s saying, yeah, I'm doing this for a year or two, but I suppose I'll have to give it up when I get married.
Yeah.
But that pioneering, I'm going to walk down the street having made really a walking exhibition of myself and taking whatever comes. If somebody wants to beat me up on the strength of it or give me grief, or if I walk into somebody else's territory, you didn't come from the East End and go dancing in Elephant Castle. That was very dangerous because they would know you were not from there. But it's have you got the front to wear these clothes?
Yeah.
And people also, young men really, which the mods then very much started doing, admiring, oh, who did that for you? How many buttons have you got? What? All of that, it's really where that starts.
Well, great, and it's a lovely book. Tells it from the very start to the fact that it's not finished, which is also great.
It's not finished. Well. It's not what it was.
And the good news is you knock out a tune as well, don't you yourself? Yeah. And before we go, there's a new record on the.
I have a solo album due out in November this year on a French label. It's 12-inch vinyl, and it's called Night Darkens the Streets.
Night Darkens the Streets on great vinyl. Max Decharne, thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.